Very warm welcome to all participants. I'm your host Mawrid from UK, and we have our regular speaker and teacher, Dr. Khalid Zaheer, and we are going to start our session. This session will have four segments. First segment will be about Quran al-Hakim. We will be focusing on verse 42, chapter 7, Surah Al-Araf. It will take 15 minutes. Then Dr. Khalid Zaheer will start the next segment, which will be on topic use of intellect in understanding in Islam. And after that, the next section, which is contemporary issue, which will have a topic clarifying slavery to the people, concept of slavery in Islam. And the last session will be about question answer, inshallah. So each segment will take 15 minutes. Yeah. So any question you have, you can note down. We have a window separately on this digital platform. You can left a question or you can speak at the end of third session. So I would like to request Dr. Khalid to start the session.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The first session, as Maratab Saab has said, is going to be on the explanation of a Quranic verse. I started from Surah Al-Fatiha and have been going through the different surahs in a sequence, not doing the entire surahs, but picking a few verses and explaining them to let people know what Quranic verses are telling us. Today's verse 42 that I have picked says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Wallazina amanu wa amilus salihat. And those who believe and do good deeds. La nukallifu nafsan illa wus'aha. We shall make no soul accountable except according to her capacity. Ulaika ashabul jannah. Such are the people who are going to be the inhabitants of the paradise. Hum fiha khalidun. They shall live there forever. This verse is clarifying a very important principle of the Almighty, which, when we do not understand properly, we are unable to see the world around us the way the Almighty has designed it and planned for it. Quite often, this question comes to one's mind, and if it doesn't come to one's mind, it's surprising, because we are puzzled when we come to learn about the fact that the Almighty is going to cause those people who believed and did good deeds to enter the paradise, and those who did not believe. And the common assumption is that those who were non-Muslims, they shall not enter the paradise because they did not have faith. Obviously, it's an understanding which is not very easy to digest. One wonders why the Almighty, who created everybody, who designed the trial of this life himself in a manner that he caused a large number of humans to be born non-Muslims. We know that it is not easy for an individual to change his faith. It's not even easy for people to change their sects. People who are born into a certain religious school of thought, a religious way of thinking, they don't change it. So, how is accountability going to take place? And if it is going to take place the way some Muslims or some Jews or some Christians or maybe people belonging to other faiths think, which is what is called an exclusivist thinking, that they believe that only they and they alone are going to be declared successful in the life hereafter. Why? Because they had the right faith. And why did they have the right faith? Because they were born there. Obviously, it doesn't make sense. The Quran in general, and this particular verse in particular, this verse that I have chosen for describing today, it comes to our rescue to explain what exactly is going to be the Almighty's criterion. What are going to be the principles that He is going to take into account in order for Him to decide what threshold, what expectation He has for people to qualify for the paradise. So the verse says, وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. And as for those who believed and did good deeds. Allow me to skip the middle part of it for the time being and move on to the third part. It says, أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ الْجَنَّةِ. Such are the people who are going to be the inhabitants of the paradise. Rightful, justifiable claimants to enter the paradise. Hum fiha khalidun. They are going to reside therein forever. Now, the two criteria that the verse is mentioning are faith and good deeds. Let's take them in the reverse order. Good deeds essentially means morally correct behavior. All humanity has been gifted with a sense of morality, which enables us humans to distinguish right from wrong, good from evil. There is no dispute amongst humanity, this big world, no matter where one belongs to, China, America, Africa, Australia, subcontinent, Russia, all believe, all know that telling the truth is good, telling lies is bad. And there is a long list of moral principles which all humanity acknowledges. So, the Almighty is mentioning that those people who do good deeds, salihat, correct, appropriate, deeds that are the right ones. Those are the deeds which our conscience from inside acknowledges that they are the right deeds. They are the ones which are correct, and the one who is doing them is doing the right thing. Now, what is faith? Faith is belief in the unseen, acknowledging those unseen realities which, even though we have not seen them, but we know that they are there. God and life hereafter in particular. Obviously, it depends on where one is born. It depends on what kind of environment one is living in. But the understanding is there in very clear terms or somewhat clear terms. The Quran tells us that the understanding of God is what we have within us, like morality, appreciation of ethical principles, uh, in our conscience. We were born with it. So, God Almighty is saying that those who believe, like moral principles, they also have this understanding, appreciation of God. Uh, those who have these two qualities, they shall enter the paradise and they'll live therein forever. But has given an explanation, a qualifying statement, and that statement is La nukallifu nafsan illa wusaha. We shall not make anyone accountable except for what is within its capacity. Wusaha, wusat is capacity, potential. Our capacity is basically a component, or is comprised of two components. Is a product of two things. Number one, our personality, our intelligence level of our emotions, our psychology, etc. And the other thing is our environment, the setting, the circumstances, surroundings that we are a part of. For example, our parents, for example, our relatives, our friends, our society. It impacts us. It does influence us. So, God is going to decide about each individual on the basis of his, her capacity as to how much faith and how much good deeds a person could do. And there would be a minimum expectation. If somebody is able to perform the minimum expectation that the Almighty had from him or her, he's going to be declared successful. This capacity is going to be different in case of different people. This is something which is clear from the Quran. A person who is forced to do certain things that are evil doesn't do them willingly, but the circumstances were such that the person had no choice. Then the Almighty says that under difficult circumstances, and one is compelled to do things which ordinarily one would not do, God is forgiving. So it's the circumstances that are going to decide about each individual, whether the person is going to be eligible for the paradise or not. This understanding brings us to at least two conclusions. Number one, we have no business whatsoever to call anyone to declare about anybody that such and such person or people belonging to such and such society are going to be deprived of entering the paradise. How can we make that statement? We do not know what the capacities of different people are, and therefore we have no business to blame people for what they are doing, because it's only God who will decide as to who is performing in accordance with the minimum expectations that he has. The other conclusion that we probably can draw is that we Muslims will have a higher level of expectation from God Almighty, because we have received his message. We acknowledge and accept the Quran and the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, as coming from God. We were designed by the Almighty to be born in a Muslim society and to be, in many cases, brought up in that society, uh, our level of expectation of the Almighty from us is going to be higher. So we can't blame others for what they're doing. All that we need to do is to invite them to have understanding of our message so that they too also are able to see God's plan more clearly. The last thing that I would mention is that the reason why many people have been led to conclude that all others except for us Muslims are going to be unsuccessful in the next life. The reason is that this understanding was true for Muslims at the time of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. Because he, after he delivered the message of God to the people of his society, the message became so very clear that those who did not accept that message, they were declared kafir, people who rejected the truth knowingly, and therefore declared eligible for the hellfire, for hell, to live there forever. However, for anybody belonging to the later times, we cannot make any firm statement. Let's worry about ourselves and let's pray for others and ourselves and present Islam properly, effectively, impressively, both through our acts, deeds, and through our verbal presentation. That ends the first part. The second part of today's presentation has to do with the regular understanding of some part of Islamic message that we have been doing ever since we started this series. In the last session, I began a discussion on faith. What is faith? Why is an individual expected to have faith? And what are the arguments of faith that we find in the Quran? I mentioned in the last presentation that when you read the Quran, you come to learn about the fact that faith is belief in the unseen, acknowledging the unseen. Why? Because it makes a lot of sense. Because the intellectual arguments presented to support the correctness of faith are so strong that they cannot be denied. So there was an obvious question that I raised before starting to speak on faith and its details. And the question was that is it allowed to use intellect in Islam? Is it even desirable? Why are we talking about faith when faith is something that has to be accepted without any question? So I said that let's first get over this difficulty. And I mentioned that there are Muslims, there are religious people who very strongly claim that our religion, the Quran, the Prophet, may Allah's mercy be on him, they've not approved use of intellect. So I mentioned a few arguments which those people who believe that intellect is not expected to be used, to be utilized while believing in the message of God. I mentioned 5 of their arguments and I responded to one argument. The 5 arguments that I presented were, number one, it is claimed that the Quran says that God-fearing people are those who believe bil ghaib. And these people who do not approve of use of intellect in Islam, they say that belief bil ghaib means belief which is blind faith without questioning. So I've already responded to that part of the claim, that part of the understanding of those people who do not approve of the use of intellect in religion. The second argument that I presented was that there are people who say that the Quran has mentioned in chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 101. They say that the Quran says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, believers, la tas'alu an ashiya. Don't ask things, don't ask questions about matters in tubdalakum. If they are disclosed to you, tasukkum, they are going to cause difficulty for you. You will be in trouble. وَإِن تَسْأَلُوهَا وَإِن تَسْأَلُوا عَنْهَا. And if you are going to ask about them, حِينَ يُنَزَّلُ الْقُرْآنِ, while the Quran is being revealed, تُبْدَلَكُمْ, it's going to be answered, it's going to be shown to you. عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْهَا. May God forgive about it. That is what you've already done. وَاللَّهُ غَفُورٌ حَلِيمٌ. And God is forgiving and He is forbearing. Now, people say that this verse and a few others, they're actually telling us that, look here, take God's religion the way it has been given to you and don't start asking questions. Because if you're going to start asking questions, then God is going to start answering them. And it's going to be problematic for you. Now, if we read this verse carefully and we see the context and the reference that the Quran is giving, what we find that this verse is pointing at is that we should not ask questions about God's Sharia, its law, and its details when the Quran is being revealed. You know, the Almighty has arranged for the Quran to be revealed. When it was getting revealed, the only right attitude that was expected was that people receive it properly, understand it properly, because the God who was revealing those expectations of the Sharia knew full well what Shariat is needed. And if people, more particularly those who were not very interested in following religion, were asking questions unnecessarily so as to know what the details of what has been revealed are, then the Almighty said that I will start revealing the details as well, which He didn't want to do. That is, He wanted people to receive His Sharia law in its simplest form and apply it through their own understanding, so that there is flexibility, there is relief, there is relaxation, that is always there as a part of what has been presented. If you start asking about the details, then God would start revealing those details, and it's not going to be good for you. So the Almighty says that in tubdalakum tasukkum, don't ask about those things which, if they're going to be revealed, it's going to be cause of harm for you. It's not going to bring anything good for you. There is a very clear example in the Quran regarding some such questions. which were asked by people who came before. And that is exactly what the next verse says. قَدْ سَأَلَهَا قَوْمٌ. There was a nation which asked similar questions. مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, before you. ثُمَّ أَصْبَحُوا بِهَا كَافِرِينَ. And they then became kafirs, deniers of truth knowingly. It's a clear reference to verses 67 to 71 of Surah Al-Baqarah, where the Almighty says that He expected from the children of Israel that they would slaughter a cow. It was a simple expectation for a certain purpose, which was a part of the Sharia of the Jews, the children of Israel. Now, it was simply an expectation that required them to look for a cow, any cow, and slaughter it. But the children of Israel were not interested. They started asking questions, lame, unnecessary, irrelevant questions. What should be the age of that cow? What should be the color of it? What exactly should it be engaged in? What should be its activities? And so on. Now, obviously a cow is a cow. I mean, you had to get hold of a cow, get it slaughtered, and the Almighty's expectations would have been done. But then they never wanted that to happen. They wanted to, as far as is possible, delay the prospects of getting the expectations of the Almighty implemented. That's the kind of question that the Almighty is requiring believers not to ask while the Quran was being revealed. Because in the case of the children of Israel, in response to each of their questions, the Almighty answered them. And the requirement of Sharia, which was very simple, that is, to get hold of a cow and slaughter it, because of persistent, unnecessary questioning, that requirement became very stringent. And the Almighty continued to answer their questions in a manner that the requirement of slaughtering a cow was narrowed down to such an extent that there remained only one cow that had to be searched for and then slaughtered. So what I'm saying is that this verse has got nothing to do with asking believers not to ask questions on religion. We will see later, inshallah, that the Almighty Himself has answered many questions in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah alone, where He Himself has raised the questions people made about certain aspects of Sharia, and He answered them. And He's also mentioned many other stories and references where asking of questions was not considered to be an undesirable tendency, but in actual fact it's something which is most certainly desirable, and it enables humans to understand God's message properly. The only thing is that questions should be genuine. The intention should be to understand and not to somehow buy time and delay the expectations to implement the Sharia. So that's the kind of questions that the Almighty has discouraged. This brings me to the end of the second segment. Now I will mention a few words about the third segment, and that is that living in the Western society, more particularly people in UK, America, Canada, etc., where, as I've been saying, quite apart from doing what has taken you there, you're also representing Islam. And your representation of Islam, you are representing Islam, uh, that makes it important for you to understand Islam and to be able to respond to the questions, to the criticisms, to the whatever allegations that are made against our religion. Sometimes because of some malicious intentions, motivations, and in many cases, the questions are very genuine. The only problem is that sometimes we do not open up to become honest enough to acknowledge that indeed it's a genuine question, and the onus of answering the question is on us. Quite often it so happens that the question is raised and we don't find ourselves in a position to answer them. And that is what makes us upset, which is sad. You know, we as believers are expected to be always open. Whether we know the answer to a question or not, we have to mention what is true, what is correct, what is justifiable. So, you know, the people living in the West, you know better than me, they have a logical mind. They are very methodical, systematic in what they're doing. Most certainly they have problems. They are indulged in certain vices which is causing them to not be quite as morally upright as they otherwise are. However, in many cases, they are reasonable people. They ask questions. There are certain things about religion, our religion in particular, which cause them to be confused, to say the least. And it's our duty to respond to those questions. I talked about jihad in my last presentation, and I'm talking about slavery in today's presentation. You know, it so happens that when somebody asks us a question which we are unable to answer, we conclude that it is some kind of a malicious propaganda. It's a conspiracy to undermine our faith, without realizing the fact that our faith demands, God Almighty demands, that we have to be absolutely fair and just, even if in doing so it goes against our own interests, the interests of our parents or our relatives. We have to be absolutely fair, even if in doing so it supports the cause of our enemies. We have to be fair. And therefore it would be a very unfortunate thing to happen, which sometimes happens, that we are being unfair for the sake of our faith. And let me be absolutely clear. When you are being unfair, in your opinion, seemingly, because of your faith, you are causing harm to your faith. Because obviously, I mean, you don't have anything to say in defense of what has been asked, and all that you're doing is you're making statements which are accusing others, or you're coming up with arguments which really are are very ordinary and weak. So we must understand. Now, why I'm making all these preliminary remarks is that slavery is one such matter which the modern man cannot come to terms with. The fact of the matter is that slavery is mentioned in the Quran in several passages. In some passages, it seems that the Almighty is very clearly allowing men to have a physical relationship with slave girls apart from their wives, which is something, as I said, that which a modern man feels uncomfortable with on learning it. So how do we respond to it? And as I said earlier, it all depends on the quality of our response that is going to have an impact on a non-Muslim, and it all depends on how we present it. The fact of the matter is that the Quran has mentioned the fact that slavery was indeed a part of the society when the Quran was being revealed. However, right from the beginning, the Quran clarified that this is something which is not acceptable. So, for instance, in Surah 90, which is Surah Al-Balad, the Almighty is talking about those people who ultimately end up getting true faith, true belief. But He says that these are the people who are able to climb, a mountain, a height. There is an obstacle which they have to climb before they reach the stage where they can get the privilege of believing. So the Almighty asks, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ? And what do you understand what that obstacle is? What that height is which needs to be ascended? And mentions a few acts of virtue. That is, there are certain acts of virtue, goodness, which people are to perform. And if they perform them, it's only then that a person will be able to get the privilege of believing. So belief is something which is gifted by the Almighty to the people who are morally upright and are able to do certain good things which are important but are difficult. That is why it's described as a height. It's something wherein you've got to make struggle to go up and climb and go past that target, that obstacle. So the Almighty asks, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ? What do you understand what that height is? And mentions a few acts of virtue. And the first of them it mentions is فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ, releasing, freeing necks. That is, there are people around you whose necks have been straightened, they have been narrowed. Their freedom has been taken away. They are deprived of moving around freely as you move around freely. Don't you see them? So it's one of the most important acts of piety that pleases God, that you make sure that these people, men and women who have been deprived of their freedom, they get emancipated, they get freed. Now, why would a message make a statement like that if the idea was to make sure that this institution of slavery continues to survive and benefit people? But the Almighty made a very clear statement right from the beginning that this is His expectation. Now, one might ask, what was stopping God from declaring that slavery is prohibited? The answer is that slavery had become a part of the society. It was, it was a part of the system. Uh, Both those who had made slaves and slave girls were benefiting from the system, as well as the slaves and slave girls themselves were benefiting from the system. And in the absence of an alternative, if they were to be forcibly freed, it would have caused more harm for them than good. Uh, you know, uh, Ordinarily, it were the prisoners of war who used to be made slaves and slave girls. They had nothing left for them. Their tribes, their fellow nationals were either killed or they had gone to places distance, far away from where they were captured, and they had become a part of the family. It was a routine which was being followed. Everybody recognized that they had certain duties to perform. Their freedom is restricted. They had a price tag attached to them, and they had certain rights also. What the Almighty did was that, quite apart from declaring the fact that freeing slaves is something which is strongly desired right from the beginning, He also introduced measures that would cause slaves and slave girls to have a status better than what they enjoyed before. This derogatory expression of slave and slave girl was removed, and they were given more acceptable, dignified expressions like a boy or a girl, etc. Likewise, the Almighty encouraged them to the masters to get them married to each other. Somebody who was a free person would get married to a slave girl or a lady to a slave. It would be counted as an act of very high value in the eyes of God, and so on. So their status was raised. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, declared, if there are people who are keeping slaves and slave girls, it is incumbent upon them that their living standard should be the same. They should eat the same food as they are eating. They should be dressed the same way as they are dressed. They should be treated equally. However, at the later stages, towards the end of the prophetic mission, there was this measure. There were two measures basically. One that required every slave and slave girl who came to the master with a demand to get released, to get freed, on a certain payment, on the understanding that the payment shall be made by the slave or say slave girl who is to be freed. The master must get the slave or slave girl freed. That demand should be heeded immediately. This is what is mentioned in Surah An-Nur, which is the 24th surah, and the verse is 33. The Almighty says, وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ, and those who approach you for a written agreement, mukatabat, mimma malakat aymanukum, from amongst those who are your slaves and slave girls, fakatibuhum, then you write it down. That is, make it a contract, do it. It's something that you need to do, provided in alimtum fihim khaira, if you find in them goodness. That is, don't do it if you feel that if they are going to be free, they're going to cause harm in the society. If they are morally okay, they're physically capable of looking after themselves, you must do it. And because a certain payment was to be made, the Almighty said, urged believers, وَآتُوهُمْ, and give to them مِمْ مَالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ, from the wealth that the Almighty has given you. That is, contribute towards their freedom by making payments. It's a great act of piety, it's a great act of spending in the way of God. If you contribute towards the payment of installments or the amount that the master is to be given. The other measure that the Quran mentioned, which ultimately, at least theoretically, ended the possibility of slavery in Islam, in a Muslim society, was what is mentioned in Surah Muhammad, which is chapter 47, wherein the Almighty, while talking about the fact that when Muslims are going to fight non-believers, in verse 4, says, فَإِذَا لَقِيتُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, and when you meet those who have disbelieved, then فَضَرْبَ الرِّقَابِ, then, fight and get rid of them, kill them. And then talking about those who were made slaves, who were made prisoners of war, the Quran says, فَإِمَّا مَنَّمْ بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فِدَاءً. Then it's either that you free them without any payment, or you charge them to be freed. The third possibility, that you make them prisoners of war, has been taken away. The Quran has not mentioned them. So had Quran encouraged slavery, this was the occasion when the Almighty should have mentioned that, look here, when you make people prisoners of war after a battle, well, make them your slaves and slave girls. The Quran has stopped believers from doing it, and we know that in the Battle of Badr, those people who were captured, they were freed after they taught Muslim children whatever they knew in the domain of reading and writing. So what we need to tell Muslims as well as non-Muslims is that the problem of slavery was not a problem created by Islam. It was not introduced by Islam. It was not promoted by Islam. It was a problem that Islam inherited from the tradition of the Arab society and got rid of it gradually, effectively, and beautifully, at least theoretically. As far as the practice of Muslims is concerned, that's none of the responsibilities of Islam, because every person, every society is free to do whatever they choose to. And if people are not understanding Islam and the Almighty's expectations, then obviously it is their problem and not the problem of the message. Now I am here for the questions you might ask me.
Jazakallah for very valuable insight, knowledge you have shared with us, sir.
Thank you.
I'm going to unmute all mics, and if any participant have a question, please feel free to ask the question directly to the teacher.
The good thing is that there are no questions.
If somebody has a technical difficulty, he or she can write here as well on the GoToWebinar. There's the chat facility and also question answer facility. Then we can read as well. So in the meanwhile, I have a question, and this question is related to the second segment, where you have describe about use of intellect, understanding Islam.
Right.
My question is a little historical perspective, that we had a couple of centuries where Muslim philosophers, scientists, they tried to rationalize the religion and made many discoveries and inventions by use of intellect. And people, they used to call them that they were very rational people, and that's why Islam made very done the materialistic success on that time. But after that, we avoid the use of intellect, and then a downfall started in Islam. So my question is that the fair understanding that the Muslims have to use the intellect on priority, then they can make a significant achievement in society?
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
yeah.
You see, I'll talk more about it in the next session and later as well, that the emphasis on use of intellect in the Quran is so overwhelming that it really is so very surprising to see that there are Muslims who have an understanding that in Islam you cannot ask questions and you cannot use your intellect. The people, the scientists, the philosophers that you are referring to in the earlier stage of our history were the ones who knew from the Quran that it's a part of their faith, it's a part of the expectation of the Almighty that we use our intellect to understand the world that He has created. You see, according to our faith, this whole brilliant world has been created by God, and it has so many things to offer to us. Some of them are visible, some have to be discovered. The laws of nature are created by God. When we try to investigate, we discover them, we are discovering God more and more. So allow me to say that our scientists, when they were indulged in their discoveries, they were not just doing a secular, mundane, worldly activity alone. It was a completely spiritual exercise. They were more motivated. They were inspired by their faith. It was a fire inside them that was causing them to explore this brilliant world, because this world has been created, designed, and is running because of the Almighty's decision. He is at the back of everything. So, as against this, call it a bland, insipid, investigation, where it's just your intellectual curiosity that is causing you to go to find out more and more about it, which in itself is exciting. What adds another dimension of motivation and excitement for a believer is that you are using your intellect and you're exploiting the resources of this world, because this is what my God, my Creator wants me to do, to discover His world and to admire Him and to feel good about it. So unfortunately we have lost that. So we need to revive it. We need to revive it through reading the Quran, understanding the Quran, and letting people know that this is God's world and it needs to be understood through our intellect.
Jazakallah. Brother Muhammad Ali has a question. Brother, you can unmute your mic and you can ask directly. You have to unmute it.
Okay, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Sir, my question is that why Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam did not get married with Bibi Maria?